Now that we've done an overview of critical systems heuristics in terms of its key principle, namely that of the boundary critique, we've talked a little bit about Werner Ulrich, and we've also talked a little bit about his inspiration in West Churchman. Let's dig into a little bit more detail about the nature of critical systems heuristics itself. Werner Ulrich says, to stress the issue of boundaries, that we do not even need the systems concept at all if we're not interested in handling system boundaries critically. Therefore, critical systems heuristics is a reflective practice that offers us a tool for understanding all of the various perspectives that people will bring to a situation. As we've identified in SOSM and in the paradigms, it is concerned with fairness and inclusion, or exclusion, and is therefore fundamentally, or paradigmatically, as Jackson would say, emancipatory practice. It acknowledges that inevitably people, when they make decisions about systems and within systems, will have biases, regardless of whatever data or evidence they have before them. People are selective about facts and norms. And so consequently, the outcome of the decisions that we make with respect to systems inevitably will benefit some parties more than others. And this is what gives rise to the need for emancipation. How can critical systems heuristics be used? It can be used in a whole raft of situations to expose conflicting assumptions or to establish or identify norms, to expose hidden agendas or hidden interests. It can also be used to identify where information is being selectively withheld. You can use it to identify embedded cultural factors or power structures that might exist within an organizational setting. It also helps give you insight into the various knowledge ecologies that would exist. It might even give visibility to the invisible groups or voice to the voiceless groups of people. It certainly exposes variations and inconsistencies in ethical frameworks. It's particularly good in conflict or adversarial situations where it identifies disagreements that either do or might lead to tension and conflict. We've said that it turns on the boundary judgment. So we draw a boundary in order to establish our system, and that boundary is made up of what Ulrich refers to as our boundary judgment, and on the outside of that is the system. Inside that, implicit in that decision that we've made, are our boundary judgments that are made up of both facts as well as values. Our facts stem from observations, and our values stem from evaluation. So consequently, critical systems heuristics is a way of bringing together the observations that we make, making the evaluation explicit in order to improve our appreciation of the system. If we want to change the system, Ulrich says, we need to shift or change the way we look at the so-called facts or the value judgments that we in actual fact make. So when we look at the system of primary concern, we identified that there are those that are involved with the system. But importantly, the context of those that are affected by it. Now, of the four bases that Ulrich identifies, firstly, there are the sources of motivation. Secondly, the sources of power. And thirdly, there are the sources of knowledge. And there are different types of questions that he proposes in order to establish and to identify what these are. And then finally, there are the sources of legitimation, which impacts on those that are affected. The critical systems heuristics procedure actually has 12 questions that have two variants asked of each to establish the way a situation currently is or the way it ought to be. It's a methodology that is designed to expose and challenge underlying assumptions by making them explicit. Assumptions about who is in actual fact benefiting or suffering from the system design. How are decisions made? Who makes those decisions? And importantly, what are the possible consequences of those decisions for those that are affected but not necessarily involved in the decision making? 12 questions that address the current situation. This is the is and the ought, the actual and the ideal. And each of the 12 questions are grouped so that there are the identification of the major stakeholder, the major concern or the major stake, and the major difficulty. So when it comes to uncovering the sources of motivation, who is or ought to be the client? That is, whose interests are or should in actual fact be served. The second question there is what is or what ought to be the purpose? That is, what are or should be the consequences? And finally, what is and what ought to be the measures of improvement? That is, how can we or should we determine that the consequences of the decisions taken together constitute an improvement? Ulrich then goes on to the second of the four bases, and that is the sources of power. Who is the decision maker and who ought to be the decision maker? That is, who is or should be in a position to change those measures of improvement. The fifth question then are what resources are controlled by the decision maker and what resources ought to be controlled by the decision maker. In other words, what conditions for success can and should those involved control? And then finally, what conditions are or ought to be part of the decision-making environment? That is, what conditions can or should be under the decision maker's control and those that are not under the control of the decision maker, i.e. from the perspective or the viewpoint of those that aren't involved. This is designed to tease out the sources of power. The third of the bases is the sources of knowledge. So, who is or ought to be considered a professional? In other words, who is to be involved as an expert, a researcher or planner or a consultant? Who is and who should be? Fourthly, what expertise ought to be consulted? In other words, what counts or should count as relevant knowledge or relevant expertise? And then finally, what or who is or who ought to be assumed to be the guarantor of success? In other words, that is, where do or should those involved seek some guarantee? What arbiter is going to be able to establish that the improvement will be achieved? For example, consensus among experts, the involvement of stakeholders, the experience and intuition of those involved, political support. So what are or what will or what should guarantee success? And then finally, the last of the four bases are the sources of legitimation. Who is or who ought to be witness to the interests of those that are affected but not involved? That is, who should be treated as a legitimate stakeholder and who argues or should argue the case of those stakeholders who cannot speak for themselves, including future generations and, importantly, non-human nature. So who will stand up for the people who are stakeholders? Or who should? The 11th question there is, what secures or ought to secure the emancipation of those affected from the premises and promises of those involved? In other words, where does legitimacy lie? And then finally, what worldview is determining these judgments, or what worldview should be determining these judgments? In other words, what different visions of improvement are there or should there be considered, and how should they or how are they reconciled?